Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Tom Cruise is getting himself American made in a true story that's plain crazy. Barry Seal, played by Tom Cruise, is a TWA airline pilot who gives up his job when contacted by a CIA agent named Schaefer, played by Domhnall Gleeson, to fly over South America and take surveillance photos and intelligence while acting as courier to General Noriega. Meanwhile, Pablo Escobar, played by Mauricio Mejia, and the Medellin cartel get Barry to fly and drop cocaine on his return journeys. As the CIA helps Barry evade the DEA by moving him and his family to the small town of Mena, Arkansas, Barry's operations expand massively, including running guns to the Nicaraguan Contras. But as things get more out of control, how long can Barry keep smuggling for both sides? Tom Cruise and Doug Liman are currently working on the sequel to their first collaboration, Edge of Tomorrow, which was a pleasant surprise all the way back in 2014, but for now we have their second film together, American Made, which tells the story of informant and smuggler Barry Seal, which was a project originally eyed up for Ron Howard at one time. And the name Barry Seal might be familiar with some people because he played a crucial role in the story of Pablo Escobar, and as such has appeared in various other film and TV incarnations, usually in fairly small roles, like in Narcos. He's popped up in an episode. He also popped up in the Bryan Cranston film The Infiltrator, played by Michael Pare, where it was decidedly less than historically accurate regarding his character. There's also been a previous film adaptation of Barry Seal's life. There's a HBO TV movie called Double Cross, which was made in the early 90s, which starred Dennis Hopper. But American Made definitely belongs to a recent sort of subgenre of films that I would describe as maybe twisted versions of the American dream. You think of things like Michael Bay's Pain and Gain, or Martin Scorsese's Wolf of Wall Street, or War Dogs, or Gold with Matthew McConaughey. They all tell stories of greed and excess and corruption, usually during the 80s. And while this isn't quite as debauched as something like The Wolf of Wall Street, and let's face it, few stories are, what this does serve as is a pleasant reminder of just how good an actor Tom Cruise can really be. Now, Cruise doesn't look anything like the real-life Barry Seal, who was quite overweight and balding, and Cruise is actually older than he was, but what he does bring to the role is his charisma, this confidence in himself no matter what, even if it's entirely misplaced. As he describes himself at one point, Barry says that sometimes I leap before I look, with that same kind of twang, and I think that's fitting. I think that sums the character up quite well. I'd also say that given the film's almost decade-long time span, the fact that it wraps up in 1986, the year Top Gun came out, is also quite appropriate because this is a guy that thinks he's Maverick. So on the one hand, you have this character that does play to Cruise's strengths as a performer, in that he's got that same sort of swagger and assuredness, and also you can see exactly why Cruise was drawn towards this part, being a real-life pilot playing this flyboy, and as such there's a lot of moments in this film where there's aerial photography that Cruise is actually piloting the planes himself, and they take advantage of that quite extensively. And the actual photography of those scenes is really impressive. There's a lot of aerial stunt work in this movie, and in addition to the usual Cruise elements, there is a big stunt. Not a huge one in comparison to his blockbusters, but there is a sequence where he does have to crash the plane, which they did do for real. But while I'm saying this, and while I'm saying that there's definitely elements of the traditional Cruise character in there, at the same time, it does feel like he's moosing up his clean-cut image, especially because after that crash, he walks out caked in cocaine and steals a little boy's bicycle and rides off on it. There's another moment in this movie where he runs around with his tooth knocked out for a good 10-15 minutes of the movie. It's just basically playing with Cruise's self-image in a certain way, and that's what makes the character quite appealing. He's got this roguish charm about him. There's a little bit of elements of something like, say, Burt Reynolds in Smokey and the Bandit, or a movie that definitely has a lot of influence on this, something like Mel Gibson or Robert Downey Jr. in Air America. And I genuinely think this is one of Cruise's best performances in a very long time. Not to put down his work in action movies, I think he's a terrific anchor at doing that, but we haven't really seen a showcase for his acting talent in a very long time. Last time he wasn't playing an action lead was maybe his supporting role in Rock of Ages, which, let's forget about that, and the last time he did it in a lead role was something like Valkyrie, and that was almost a decade ago. Here, Cruise not only seems right in his element, but he's having so much fun with this part, and he seems really engaged with it. Everything about this character seems very fully formed, and it shows you exactly why Cruise works as a performer, but also he brings a certain level of charm to the character. In spite of his complete immorality, you like him quite a lot, and you understand exactly how he's managed to charm his way with all these different sides and how they've managed to put their trust in him. He seems like such an affable fellow. And honestly, if Cruise's performance in this film didn't work, then the whole thing just collapses, because he is the centre of this movie. Everything is about Cruise, as it typically is with one of his vehicles. But he manages to pull that off with such ease, and it really shows what he can do when he's not just running all the time. And I think that once he does manage to put some of those roles behind him and embraces the fact that yes, he is getting older, he can't be chasing his youth all the time, I think there will be plenty of plum parts for him in the future. But getting back to Barry himself, Barry manages to attain the American dream because he doesn't have any particular qualms about anything that he's doing. He's described as the gringo that always delivers. And you know what? He could almost use that as his slogan, to be perfectly honest, because if you ask it of him, he'll frankly deliver it on his plane. It doesn't matter if it's drugs. It doesn't matter if it's guns that's going to the Contras, or he's shipping them back to America so that the CIA can train them. It doesn't matter what the contents of his plane are. All that matters is, can he take off with it? Is it too heavy to put on the back of the plane? Otherwise, fine. And as such, that is the key to his success. And so he's flying around with this plane that is absolutely chock-a-block with cocaine, and he doesn't really care about that so long as he can dump it off at a swamp before he lands and before the inspection, so that he has a completely empty plane once he's back on the runway. Totally fine. This is something that in another character, or if it was portrayed wrong, you wouldn't necessarily like him, but again, Cruise's affability and his presence, it carries you through that. And because Barry delivers no matter what, that means he's perfect to be used and exploited for others' ends. Case in point, the CIA agent played by Domhnall Gleeson in a wonderfully slimy supporting part, who uses the intel that Barry provides him with, namely the photos he takes on the underside of his plane, as a way of enhancing his own career. He's very aware of what Seal is doing on the side, and in fact actually aids and abets him in doing it by helping him evade the authorities at several points of the narrative, even giving him the DEA flight routes so that he can avoid detection. And so what you have is this very American corruption that again is how Seal succeeds for so long in doing this. You have these interagencies interacting with each other, but they don't really know what each other are doing. So you've got the DEA who are very much on Seal's tail, not realising that the CIA is actually helping Seal as a distinct cross purposes with their different agendas. And the film again minds that for a lot of its humour. It is based on a true story, and a lot of the conspiracy theories around Barry, because a lot of this can't exactly be confirmed, but even still, there's a lot of events that we do know actually happened, but even in the framing of the narrative, they're almost entirely preposterous. The movie just keeps escalating and escalating, and I was watching the movie almost in a sense of disbelief. And that's exactly where you want to be when you're watching a film like this. You almost want to be compelled to see it, just to see what ridiculous thing actually happened next. Yeah, some of it is probably exaggerated for the purpose of the story, but it doesn't seem like they've really embellished all that much. And there certainly seems to be a bit of a trademark in these films I've noticed lately, in that there does seem to be at least one point in the narrative where the protagonist, who's narrating his own story, will break the fourth wall to remind us that what we're watching did actually happen, or in the case of Pain and Gain, freeze frame to throw up that this is a true story disclaimer, usually at the most ridiculous moment in the narrative. And it reiterates how sometimes the truth really can be stranger than fiction. If you saw what happened in American Made in a film that was entirely fictional, you'd call it completely implausible and utterly absurd, and yet so much of this actually happened. It also makes sense that they picked this tone. It makes what Barry's doing sit a little bit easier with the audience, because there is a couple of small changes to facts through the movie that maybe soften up Barry as a character. For instance, his real-life counterpart did not walk away from his airline job as depicted in the movie. He was fired for smuggling C4. I can understand why they changed that. That doesn't really sit with the portrayal of him in the movie itself. Another way the film tries to make you empathetic towards Barry is that it spends so much time focused on his family, in particular his wife, played by Sarah Wright, and this is where the film probably makes its biggest misstep. You see, I've already mentioned that Cruise has been chasing his youth for quite a while in his films now. He's in his 50s, and he looks good for it, but he's still in his 50s, and it is starting to show now. And it's definitely becoming a bit of an issue that his female co-stars are considerably younger than he is. It's not a trend exclusive to Cruise, but it definitely is an embodiment of the sort of older male action star, young female lead. And in this case, Wright is 20 years Cruise's junior, and very visibly so. At certain points in this film, they almost look like they could be father and daughter, which is probably not the dynamic that they were aiming for, I've got to be honest. You know what, maybe I could look past that if they had any kind of chemistry together. They don't. So that makes this issue even more pronounced, because not only do they visibly don't look like they're really a couple, they don't sell you on the idea of it. And because the film is at least partially riding on the idea that Barry is doing this to support his family because of all the money, it just doesn't work on screen. Honestly, it's so distracting. They should have recast this with an actress that was much more appropriate to Cruise's age, and frankly would have been a better performer. It's an issue that keeps cropping up every time the movie goes back to this subplot. Every time the movie goes back to this relationship, it falls flat. And she's the one misfiring element in this movie, because on an acting level, Cruise has surrounded himself with some very good performers. I don't think they get very big roles in this movie a lot of the time, but there are some really capable performers. They're just not hugely utilised. Case in point, the other major female character is a DA played by Jayma Mays, who wants to track down Barry, but her character doesn't appear in the film until 2/3 of the way through, and she only appears in maybe 2 or 3 scenes. Again, that seems like something that probably would have been a little bit more of the focus of the movie, ideally. I would have wanted to see a couple more scenes about that, and her having to deal with the bureaucracy of having to chase Barry down. The real supporting player that runs away with this movie, though, is Caleb Landry Jones, playing another one of his real creeps. He plays Barry Seal's brother-in-law, who shows up, who looks like a screw-up, and you know is going to at least be the instigating motion towards things eventually collapsing for Barry. You just watch what's going on in this movie and you spend the whole time going, okay, when is this guy's luck going to run out? And a lot of this movie's manic energy can be directly attributed to Doug Liman's direction, which is normally quite quickly cut to begin with, but here is especially fast. He hits the ground running right out of the gate, because there's only 2 hours and there's a lot of history to tell. Barry's life was so eventful that you could probably get a whole mini-series out of it. As such, there are definitely points in this movie where it doesn't give itself enough time to breathe. There are so many events happening on screen that we don't get to fully process it. But in conjunction with the framing device of Barry narrating his story directly to his VHS camcorder, that scruffy, sort of free associative style does actually work, particularly in the moments where the film actually stops for a moment to explain the proper historical context via these animated interstitials. The framing device of Barry talking directly to camera does actually manage to ground this somewhat outrageous story to a somewhat vaguely realistic place. You actually are sort of along for the ride just simply because of his charm. And Liman's direction, you can tell that he's very much leaned on the 80s aesthetic, not just because of the VHS camcorder, but also because of just the period details, like the expensive, for that point in time, gifts that he buys his family, the studio logos that transform into their older counterparts. Just small things like that that help sell the world of the movie. But Liman's sort of concessions to realism do occasionally become problems in their own right. In particular, the handheld style. This movie is almost entirely handheld, and I think what he was going for was this sort of documentary-like realism. And I know that the looseness of the camera work is again meant to be representative of the anarchic story that we're telling on screen, but there has to be a way of conveying that doesn't feel so self-conscious. It was something that really pulled me out of it. It's an example of directorial quirks actually working against a movie. I think given that there was a lot of story to be told, that really Liman perhaps should have maybe reined himself in. In spite of those things, I liked American Made a lot. Does it have its faults? Yes, it does, but it's a testament to the star power of Tom Cruise that you can easily look past that. He carries this movie virtually all the way through it, and I think he's brilliant in it, but it also helps that he's got this really compelling story behind him. I think it shows just how crazy this movie is, that Pablo Escobar is virtually an incidental character in the grand scheme of things. But it's just a very entertaining movie. It has all the elements that you would want from a wild, true story like this. Yeah, it's not quite up to the best of this kind of subgenre, but it's very hard to compete with The Wolf of Wall Street and just what happens in that film. Not that American Made doesn't give it a very close run for its money. I think you'll watch this film and you'll both be laughing, but also shocked at what happens in it. American Made is a true story that's so utterly outrageous at every turn that you'll find yourself wondering where it'll go next, and carries the film even at its weaker points, although as much of that is because of Cruise himself. Partly playing to type with all the plane stunts and partly setting himself up at the same time, he plays Barry Seal with a roguish charm in spite of his amorality and increasing disbelief at his own circumstances, a fine reminder of what the star can do dramatically when he's not sprinting his way through blockbusters. The film's commentary on the American dream and government corruption are not subtle, but Liman directs energetically even when delivering much needed historical context, although sometimes his style, specifically his shaky camera work, can get in the way. But American Made's a damn good yarn that's at points hysterically stranger than fiction. If you like this review, fly on over to my Patreon where I deliver my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.